Can aggression inspire a movement? That's the question at the heart of hardcore punk, born from anger and alienation, but destined to provide catharsis and community. In the 1970s, as peace and love faded, youth were craving a new sound that channeled their frustrations. From this need, hardcore began. In this video, we'll trace the story of hardcore's evolution from a spark of frustration to a cultural wildfire. The 1970s was a pivotal decade for music. As the peace and love vibes of the 60s faded, a new generation of young people were looking for a soundtrack that spoke to their frustration and anger over social issues, the Vietnam War, and economic troubles. Out of this climate, hardcore punk emerged as a raw, aggressive genre that would plant the seeds for multiple subcultures to bloom in the coming decades. But why did this new generation turn to such an extreme sound? What made hardcore the outlet for their anger? Read on to trace the birth of the hardcore revolution, beginning with the proto-punk sounds that marked its origins. Hardcore finds its origins in the garage and proto-punk acts of the late 60s, like the Stooges and the MC5. These groups emphasized a stripped-down and aggressive musical style that channeled rage rather than the indulgent arena rock or commercialized hippie aesthetic that dominated the mainstream at the time. Their political and anti-establishment lyrical perspective would directly influence bands like the Ramones and Sex Pistols, when punk rock erupted as a movement centered in New York and London around 1976. Punk struck a chord by echoing the emotions of restless youth. But could the sound go even further into dark and dangerous territory? New York City proved to be exceptionally fertile ground for punk to take root. The New York Dolls brought theatrical proto-punk to venues like Birdland and Max's Kansas City earlier in the decade. But as the scene migrated downtown, new bands eliminated the glam and flamboyance in favor of minimalist rage. Bands like Television, Suicide, Richard Hell and the Ramones took to dingy stages in the Bowery district, pioneering a raw sound that came to define punk. These artists looked beyond rock's contemporary extravagance toward the gritty simplicity of rock's roots in garage rock, surf rock, and early R&B. Their songs had rebellious, yet often smart, lyrical themes, critiquing complacent conformity. Even though one early reviewer compared the sound to a chainsaw cutting through steel, ears were perking up to the new music erupting at places like infamous Lower East Side club CBGB's. The underground had found its new voice in punk. But could the punk ethos be mutated into an even more uncouth and vicious form? Enter the Dead Boys. Hailing from Cleveland, this band moved to New York chasing after the burgeoning punk scene after lead singer Stiv Bators kept pushing his bandmates to experience famed CBGBs. Attracted to the violent, primitive energy and anything-goes attitudes at punk's ground zero, the Dead Boys soon rose to prominence themselves even amongst punk's gritty elite. Their performances were infamous, often ending shows in utter chaos and riots, as Bators channeled Iggy Pop's unpredictable stage presence and confrontation. Sonically, the Dead Boys took punk's aggressiveness even further. Their fast tempos, dark minor chord riffs and worship of bands like the Stooges marked them as something beyond standard punk fare. Today known as proto-hardcore, the Dead Boys' intensity and Bators' extreme antics, like self-mutilation on stage, set them apart, cementing their reputation as the godfathers of hardcore punk. So punk had successfully channeled rage, but could this new sound grow beyond punk's coastal origins? What did hardcore look like across America? As hardcore punk was crystallizing in New York City grit, a parallel evolution was happening in Los Angeles on the West Coast. The sunshine and glitz of Hollywood couldn't mute the disaffected youth searching for rebellion beyond the Sunset Strip. Bands like The Germs and Black Flag forged the first wave of West Coast hardcore. Rather than directly channel 60s rock or pop influences, these acts distilled the aggression and speed of early punk into tighter song structures and more emphatic political messaging. There were commonalities with their NYC peers: rebellion against societal norms and channeling real frustration into catharsis. Once Black Flag began spreading this new hardcore sound through relentless nationwide touring, they found it resonated with alienated youth fare from California. Their violent confrontational shows incorporated elements of performance art and audience assault. Other bands like Dead Kennedys followed suit, helping prove punk wasn't just an isolated trend in coastal cities. It was a musical movement, giving young outsiders and misfits an outlet to be heard, and together transcend societal disillusionment. Now, connecting these once isolated scenes, how did hardcore spread and evolve? These connections showed how hardcore was mutating punk and spreading internationally through the bootleg tapes and homemade zines traded in an increasingly connected underground network. Black Flag's performances across North America and Canada, winning over alienated youth, eventually interacting with emerging bands such as Vancouver hardcore pioneers, DOA, who adopted the sound. Soon Boston, Washington, D.C., and other cities began fostering their own distinct hardcore subcultures. What values did these regional scenes represent? And could the hardcore ethos thrive while keeping its underground independence? By the early 80s, distinct hardcore punk scenes were coalescing regionally, from Boston to Los Angeles. In New York, configurations grew out of young crews centered in working-class neighborhoods of the city's boroughs. The philosophies of straight edge and self-reliance took hold, extolling discipline and self-control as an act of rebellion against spiraling addiction, inequality, commercialism, and dangerous indulgence represented by mainstream rock excess. Bands like Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags, and Gorilla Biscuits channeled their frustration through exceedingly fast, trashy punk that came to be known as youth crew hardcore and connected with disaffected youth beyond just music. Their blistering soundtracks rejecting society's ills evolved from punk rock structures to incorporate heavier influences from metal. Breakdowns, guitar solos, and early crossover would help set the template for extreme subgenres to follow. Could hardcore retain its independent spirit and purity of vision while infiltrating popular consciousness? Since its origins, hardcore had been music both by and for outsiders. Most first-wave hardcore bands were dedicated to avoid mainstream exposure for fear of diluting the music's rawness. But by the mid-80s, two record deals demonstrated that while far from commercial, hardcore was penetrating popular music's radar. In 1986, two pivotal albums were released, reflecting each coast's distinct hardcore evolution. First, LA punk veterans Bad Brains put out Eye Against Eye on California indie label SST Records. Incorporating progressive tempo shifts and reggae contrasts, it displayed hardcore didn't have to adhere to traditional punk structures. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, straight-edge pioneers Youth of Today simultaneously released their seminal debut LP on New York indie label Revelation Records. While sonically raw and aggressive, its production quality was clean and balanced compared to earlier hardcore records. These landmark indie albums indicated that hardcore could maintain its independent spirit and connection to fans while exposing the movement to more mainstream audiences. So 30+ years later, what's the lasting impact of hardcore? Did it retain its spirit while influencing other extreme sounds? By the late 80s, hardcore had permeated across the international music landscape with flourishing scenes on multiple continents. The 90s saw hardcore's influence expand into heavy music subcultures like thrash metal, doom, and grindcore, while pioneering and presaging extreme subgenres like emotional hardcore and screamo. Today, hardcore continues to mutate into newer forms like beatdown and metalcore, proving that nearly 50 years since its inception, the revolution that started with these pioneering bands continues to reverberate. Fresh generations instill their unique regional perspectives while expressing their frustrations through the primal power of hardcore. So how can we summarize the legacy of this movement born from basement anger that continues inspiring youth to this day? From New York grit to California warehouses, the birth pangs of hardcore marked a milestone for underground music. It provided an outlet for outsiders to build connection and community by channeling frustration into catharsis through aggressive creativity. The musical statement made by bands like Black Flag and Dead Boys, who took punk rock to the next level, still echoes today. Their sonic and cultural impact shaped the evolution of punk by doing it themselves, without a mainstream filter right up from the streets. This DIY approach created a musical revolution whose influence persists whenever an outcast youth discovers their own voice by plugging into the power of hardcore. What modern music revolution could be inspired by the lessons of hardcore's beginnings? Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the roots of the hardcore revolution, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more glimpses into impactful music countercultures. Until next time, stay tuned and stay hardcore.